You don't hear it, do you? The old man's voice was low, almost lost beneath the restless hum of generators and the distant whine of jet traffic rolling across the airfield. But it cut through the tension sharper than any shouted order as Captain Ryan Holt let out a short, dismissive laugh and wiped sweat from his brow. The midday sun pressing down on the tarmac like a weight, heat shimmering in waves above the silent A-10 parked dead center of the runway, its dull gray skin reflecting a harsh white glare that made it look more like a monument than a machine. And that was the problem, because for the last 4 hours, it hadn't moved, hadn't responded, hadn't even tried, while a full team of technicians in crisp coveralls circled it with tablets and diagnostic rigs, each screen glowing green with the same infuriating verdict. Everything nominal, everything operational, everything fine, except the aircraft itself, which sat there like it had decided, on its own, that it was done flying, and Holt was running. Out of patience, out of explanations, and more importantly, out of time, because across the runway, a row of black SUVs idled under a temporary canopy where a colonel and a group of visiting brass were waiting for a demonstration flight that was now an hour overdue, and the silence of the A-10 was becoming louder than any engine roar ever could. So when he turned and saw the old man standing just beyond the maintenance line, hands in the pockets of a faded field jacket, posture relaxed, eyes fixed not on the crew but on the aircraft itself, it struck him as absurd, almost insulting, like a ghost wandering into the wrong decade. And that was when Holt made his mistake. "You got something to add, sir?" he called out, his tone sharp with sarcasm, drawing a few chuckles from the younger techs nearby. The old man didn't answer right away, his pale blue eyes tracing the curve of the engine housing, the intake, the seams along the paneling, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. And that quiet only made Holt push harder, stepping closer, boots crunching against the gravel edge of the runway. "Tell you what," he said, loud enough now for everyone to hear. "Why don't you go ahead and start her up for us? Since you seem so interested, more laughter this time, sharper, more confident, the kind that feeds on certainty, because to them, this was a sealed system, a modern aircraft governed by sensors, software, and protocols, not by intuition, not by memory, certainly not by a man who looked like he belonged in a museum." But the old man finally shifted his gaze, not to Holt, not to the crew, but to the nose of the A-10. And when he spoke again, it wasn't defensive, it wasn't offended, it was simple, almost curious. "She's not dead," he said, the words landing softly, almost swallowed by the heat. "She's just not being heard." Holt smirked, shaking his head, already turning away, already dismissing it as nonsense. But a few feet back, Airman Lucas Reed didn't laugh. He stood still, watching the old man's eyes, the way they moved, the way they didn't match the rest of him, because there was something there, something steady, something that didn't belong in a place filled with noise and urgency. And for a brief second, Reed felt it too, that strange, unsettling quiet hanging over the aircraft, like the absence of a sound that should have been there all along. Captain Ryan Holt turned away with a scoff, already gesturing for his team to resume their diagnostics, his voice snapping back into command mode, as if the moment had never happened. "Run the ignition sequence again. Full reset. I want every system cycled." And the technicians moved quickly, fingers tapping across glass screens, cables reconnecting, the quiet hum of equipment rising once more. But the aircraft did not respond. The A-10 remained still, its turbines cold, its presence heavy, like it was waiting for something none of them understood. And the longer it stayed silent, the more the tension stretched across the tarmac, thin and brittle under the afternoon heat. Holt clenched his jaw, glancing toward the canopy where the visiting officers stood, their silhouettes sharp against the glare, watching, waiting, judging. And that pressure made him sharper, louder, pushing harder against a problem that refused to break. While behind him, the old man had not moved, his gaze still, locked on the aircraft, his head tilted just slightly, like a man listening for a distant signal carried on the wind. Airman Lucas Reed shifted uneasily, lowering the tablet in his hands as he stepped closer to the intake, following the same line of sight, trying to see what the old man saw. But all he could hear was the faint hiss of hot air rolling over metal and the ticking of cooling components. Nothing unusual, nothing obvious. And yet something fell off, something just beneath the surface of it all, like a note out of tune that only one person in the room could hear. "It is not a system failure," the old man said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, just into the space between the noise and the silence. Holt exhaled sharply, turning back with irritation flashing across his face. "We are done with the commentary, sir," he said, each word clipped and controlled. "This is a restricted operation." But the old man did not react to the tone, did not rise to the challenge. He simply took a step forward, slow and deliberate, stopping just short of the aircraft's wing. The heat from the tarmac rising around him in shimmering waves, his hand brushing lightly against the worn fabric of his jacket pocket. And for a brief second, Reed noticed it. The way his fingers paused there, like they recognized something familiar, something older than the machines surrounding them. Holt noticed the movement too, his patience thinning further. "That is close enough," he warned, stepping forward to intercept. But Reed spoke before he could stop himself, the words slipping out with a hesitation that betrayed his uncertainty. "Sir, maybe we should let him look." The sentence hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. Holt turned slowly, disbelief written across his face. "You want me to hand over a multi-million-dollar aircraft to a civilian because he feels something?" The sarcasm cut deep, drawing a few uneasy glances from the crew. Reed swallowed, but did not back down completely, his eyes flicking between the silent jet and the old man who stood there as if time itself moved differently around him. "No, sir. I think he hears something we do not." The words sounded strange even as he said them, but they did not feel wrong, and that was enough to shift something subtle in the air, a crack in the certainty that had filled the runway all morning. Holt shook his head, dismissing it, turning back toward the aircraft with a frustrated wave of his hand. "Fine," he muttered under his breath, more to end the distraction than out of belief. "You have 30 seconds, old man. Then you step away." The crew fell quiet, the hum of machines fading just enough for the silence to creep back in, heavier now, expectant, as the old man finally stepped closer to the A-10, his presence calm, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world while everyone else was running out of it. The old man stopped just beneath the wing, the shadow of the A-10 cutting a sharp line across his boots as the heat shimmered around him. And for a moment he did nothing, no grand gesture, no immediate action, just stillness, the kind that made the surrounding noise feel intrusive, out of place, as if the entire runway had been moving too fast and he alone had chosen to slow down. Captain Holt crossed his arms, watching with thinly veiled impatience, already counting down the seconds he had given, while the technicians stood frozen in a loose semicircle, their confidence unsettled by the absence of anything they could measure or explain. Eli Carter lifted his hand slowly, not toward the obvious panels the team had already opened and inspected, but toward a narrow seam along the side of the engine housing, his fingers hovering just above the metal without touching it, as if feeling for something in the air itself. Lucas Reed leaned in slightly, his breath held without realizing it, trying to follow the movement, trying to understand. But there was nothing there, no visible damage, no warning light, no indication of failure, just smooth, perfectly aligned panels reflecting the blinding afternoon sun. "You sealed it too tight," Eli said quietly, his voice calm, almost thoughtful. Holt frowned, stepping closer. "What does that even mean?" he asked, irritation creeping back into his tone. Eli did not look at him. His eyes remained on the aircraft, tracing invisible lines only. He seemed to recognize. "She cannot breathe," he added, the words simple, almost strange, but they landed with a weight that shifted something subtle in the air. One of the technicians let out a short, uncertain laugh. "It is an engine, not a living thing," he muttered, but the sound lacked conviction, because despite the data, despite the systems, the aircraft had been silent for hours, and nothing they had done had changed that. Eli finally reached into his jacket and pulled out a small worn leather pouch. The surface cracked and darkened by time, its edges softened from decades of use. It looked out of place among the polished tools and digital equipment scattered across the tarmac. Holt's expression tightened again, disbelief mixing with frustration. "We are not opening anything else," he said firmly. "Those panels are sealed for a reason." Eli glanced at him then, not with defiance, not with challenge, but with a quiet certainty that made the words feel less like a request and more like a statement of fact. "Then it will stay silent," he said, and for a brief second, no one spoke. The weight of that possibility settling over the group. Reed felt at first, that shift from confidence to doubt, from control to uncertainty, and he could see it ripple outward, in the way the technicians hesitated, in the way Holt's jaw tightened just a fraction more. As if the situation had slipped slightly beyond his grasp, Eli knelt slowly beside the engine housing, setting the pouch down with deliberate care, his movements steady despite his age, and as he opened it, the faint scent of worn leather and something older drifted into the hot air. Inside were not modern instruments, not precision tools or diagnostic devices, but simple, well-used pieces of metal, each one carrying the quiet marks of time, and as his fingers hovered over them, selecting one with practiced ease, the noise of the airfield seemed to fade. Again, leaving only the sound that had been there all along, the one no one else had noticed, the one that had brought him here in the first place. The metal felt warm beneath Eli Carter's fingertips, not hot from the sun, but holding a different kind of heat, the kind that lingered where it should not, where air should have been moving, circulating, breathing, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the noise of the airfield fall away until all that remained was the faintest whisper of imbalance, a pressure that did not release, a silence that was not natural. And when he opened them again, his hand moved with quiet certainty to a small, nearly invisible panel tucked just beneath the intake lip, a place no one had touched because every diagnostic had declared it perfect. "That panel is sealed," one of the technicians said quickly, stepping forward, his voice edged with concern now rather than arrogance. "Breaking that voids protocol." Eli did not look up, his focus unwavering. "Protocol does not fly the aircraft," he replied, his tone even, as if stating something too obvious to argue. Captain Holt took a step closer, his patience thinning into something sharper, more dangerous. "You were given 30 seconds to look, not to start tearing into classified equipment." But even as he spoke, there was hesitation beneath the authority, a flicker of doubt that had not been there before. Eli's fingers worked the edge of the panel, not forcing it, not prying, but testing it, feeling the resistance, the tension held within, like a door that had been shut too tightly for too long. And then he selected a small, worn tool from his pouch, its surface dulled by years of use, fitting it into place with a precision that came from memory rather than measurement. Lucas Reed watched closely, his pulse quickening, because there was no guesswork in the movement, no uncertainty, just a quiet, practiced rhythm that made everything around it feel clumsy by comparison. The tool turned with a soft, controlled motion, and for a second, nothing happened. Then a faint shift, almost imperceptible, a release so subtle it could have been missed entirely, but Eli felt it, and his shoulders eased just slightly. "There it is," he murmured, more to the machine than to anyone else. The technician who had spoken earlier leaned in, confusion replacing his earlier confidence. "What did you do?" Eli did not answer directly. Instead, he lifted the panel just enough to expose a narrow channel beneath, a space where air should have moved freely but had been restricted, trapped by a misalignment so small it had escaped every system they trusted. "She has been trying to breathe through a closed throat," he said quietly, adjusting the alignment with careful, deliberate pressure, the movement precise, down to a fraction of an inch. And as he did, something changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough. The air shifted, a faint, almost inaudible intake of movement where before there had been none. Reed felt it before he understood it. A subtle difference in the way the heat rolled off the engine housing, a change in the rhythm of the silence itself. Captain Holt frowned, his eyes narrowing as he watched, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he knew, everything he had been trained to trust, and finding no clear answer. Eli replaced the panel with the same care he had used to open it, securing it without force, without haste, as if returning something to its rightful place. Then he stood, brushing his hands lightly against his jacket, his expression unchanged, calm, certain, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And for a moment, no one spoke, the entire crew caught in that fragile space between disbelief and realization, until Eli turned slightly, his gaze settling briefly on Holt. Not confrontational, not triumphant, just steady. "Now you can start her," he said, and the words hung in the air, simple and absolute, waiting to be proven true. Captain Holt did not move right away, the words settling over him like heat rising off the runway. Simple, direct, and impossible to ignore, and for the first time that afternoon, he hesitated, not because he believed, but because something in the certainty of the old man's voice did not leave room for doubt, the kind of certainty that did not argue, did not persuade, it simply existed, and that unsettled him more than any malfunction ever could. He glanced toward the aircraft, then toward his crew, their faces no longer confident, no longer certain, but watching, waiting, as if the next moment mattered more than anything that had come before. "Run it," Holt said finally, his voice lower now, controlled, but lacking the edge it had carried earlier. One of the technicians moved quickly, almost too quickly, eager to break the silence, fingers moving across the control panel, initiating the ignition sequence once more, the same sequence they had run again and again, the same commands, the same expected outcome, failure. And for a brief second, nothing changed. The aircraft remained still, the air heavy, the silence stretching just long enough to make doubt creep back in. Holt exhaled sharply, already preparing to shut it down, to reclaim control, to dismiss the entire moment as coincidence or illusion. And then it happened, not as an explosion, not as a sudden roar, but as a shift, subtle at first. A low vibration beneath the metal, a faint hum that had not been there before. Lucas Reed felt it through the soles of his boots, his eyes widening. As he looked up at the engine housing, the sound growing, building, finding its place, and then the turbines caught. The A-10 came alive with a deep, powerful resonance that rolled across the tarmac. Not violent, not chaotic, but controlled, steady, undeniable. The kind of sound that filled the air and pushed everything else aside. Conversation stopped, movement froze. Even the distant activity on the airfield seemed to pause as the aircraft finally responded, the engines turning with smooth precision as if they had never been silent at all. Holt stood completely still, his eyes locked on the aircraft, his mind racing to explain what he was seeing, what he was hearing, but no explanation came, because the systems had said it should have worked before, and it had not, and now, after a single adjustment no computer had detected, it did, perfectly, flawlessly. As if the machine itself had been waiting for that one exact correction, the technician at the panel pulled his hands back. Slowly, almost reverently, as if afraid to disrupt what had just been restored, Reed turned instinctively toward Eli Carter, expecting to see some reaction, some acknowledgement. But the old man was already stepping back, his expression unchanged, calm, as if the outcome had never been in question, as if this had simply been the natural order of things. The engines continued their steady rhythm, the sound filling the space where doubt had lived only moments before, and across the runway, beneath the canopy, a figure stepped forward, a senior officer drawn by the unmistakable sound of a machine returning to life, his posture sharp, his attention focused, and as he began to walk toward the aircraft, the shift in the atmosphere deepened. Because this was no longer just a technical success, it was something else entirely, something that had not yet been fully understood, but was about to be recognized. The sound of the engines settled into a steady, powerful rhythm, no longer struggling, no longer searching, but holding firm like it had finally found its balance. And as the vibration spread across the tarmac, it carried with it a shift in the atmosphere that no one could ignore. Conversations died before they could begin, movement slowed, and every eye turned toward the same point. The aircraft that had refused them all now responding as if nothing had ever been wrong. Captain Holt stood, rigid, his authority still intact on the surface, but beneath it something had fractured, something small but undeniable, because this outcome had not come from his commands, not from his team, and not from the systems he trusted, and that realization sat heavy in his chest, unspoken but present. Lucas Reed remained where he was, his attention fixed on Eli Carter, watching the way the old man stepped back from the aircraft without urgency, without pride, as if his part in this moment had already ended. And Reed felt a quiet certainty settle in his mind, the kind that did not come from data or training, but from recognition, from understanding that he had just witnessed something real, something that could not be replicated by procedure alone. The technicians exchanged glances, their earlier confidence replaced by a cautious respect, their voices lowered, their movements more deliberate, as if the space around the aircraft demanded a different kind of behavior now. And through it all, the engines continued, steady and strong, filling the air with a sound that had become more than mechanical. It was confirmation, it was proof, and from across the runway, the senior officer approached with measured steps, his uniform sharp, his posture commanding without effort. Colonel David Mercer moved with a purpose that cut through the lingering uncertainty, his gaze fixed not on the aircraft itself, but on the small group gathered beside it, and more specifically, on the man. Standing just outside the circle of attention, Eli Carter did not turn to meet him, did not acknowledge the approach. He simply stood there, calm, as if he had expected this moment long before anyone else realized it was coming. Holt straightened instinctively as the colonel drew closer, his voice returning, sharper now. "Sir, we have resolved the issue," he reported, the words formal, controlled, but lacking the certainty they would have carried earlier. Mercer did not respond immediately, his eyes moving past Holt, past the technicians, settling on Eli, studying him with a quiet intensity that suggested recognition, not of the man's face, but of something deeper, something earned. The colonel slowed, stopping a few feet away, the sound of the engines filling the space between them, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. The entire scene suspended in that narrow space where understanding begins to surface. Reed felt it again, that shift, stronger now, heavier, as if the weight of the moment had increased, because this was no longer just about an aircraft starting, it was about who had made it happen, and why. Mercer's expression changed almost imperceptibly, the sharp edges of command softening into something more measured, more deliberate, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different kind of authority, one that did not need to assert itself. "Who authorized him to be here?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a question that already carried its own answer, and no one responded right away, because for the first time that day, the chain of command was no longer the most important thing on the runway. The question lingered in the air, quiet but heavy, and for a moment no one answered because no one was entirely sure how to. Captain Holt shifted his weight, his mind moving quickly through protocol, through rank, through the structure he had relied on his entire career, but none of it seemed to fit what had just happened. "Sir, he was not authorized," Holt said finally, his voice controlled but tighter than before. He approached during the diagnostic phase. Colonel Mercer did not look at him. As he spoke, his attention remained fixed on Eli Carter, studying him with a focus that made everything else feel secondary, as if the answer to his question was already standing in front of him. Lucas Reed felt it again, that subtle shift, the sense that something unseen was unfolding, something that did not follow the usual order of things. Eli stood quietly, his posture unchanged, the engines behind him continuing their steady rhythm, the sound now less intrusive, more like a backdrop to a moment that had grown far larger than the machine itself. Mercer took another step forward, closing the distance, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if confirming something long buried in memory. "What is your name?" he asked, the tone not demanding, not harsh, but precise. Eli met his gaze for the first time, and there was no hesitation in his response. "Eli Carter," he said simply, the name spoken without emphasis, without expectation, but it landed differently, not because of how it was said, but because of how it was received. Mercer's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for Reed to notice, enough for Holt to feel it without understanding it. A flicker of recognition passed across the colonel's face, something deeper than familiarity, something tied to history, to stories that were not written in manuals or stored in systems. Holt straightened again, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir," regardless of who he is, he bypassed. Mercer raised a hand, a small motion, but it was enough to stop the sentence before it could finish, the authority in it absolute, effortless, and for the first time since the aircraft had come alive, Holt fell silent, not by choice, but because there was no space left to speak. Mercer's attention returned fully to Eli, his voice quieter now, more measured. "Where did you serve?" he asked, and Eli did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting briefly toward the aircraft, as if the question was not about location, Not about units or assignments, but about something else entirely, something harder to put into words. Where I was needed, he said after a moment. The response simple, almost understated, but it carried a weight that did not need elaboration. Reed felt a chill despite the heat rising off the runway, because the answer did not sound like avoidance. It sounded like truth, the kind that did not require detail to be understood. Mercer exhaled slowly, his posture shifting just enough to signal a change, not in rank, not in authority, but in perspective. And when he spoke again, there was something different in his tone, something that had not been there when he first stepped onto the runway. You worked on these airframes, he said, not as a question, but as a recognition. Eli gave the slightest nod, and in that small motion, something settled, something unspoken but clear, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was deliberate, the kind that comes when everyone realizes they have been standing in the presence of something they did not recognize at first, and now could not ignore. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, as if something long overlooked had finally stepped into the light. And Colonel Mercer held Eli Carter's gaze for a moment longer before slowly straightening, not in a display of authority, but in recognition, the kind that came from experience rather than rank. The engines behind them continued their steady rotation, the sound now constant, grounding, like a heartbeat that had finally found its rhythm. And Mercer turned slightly, his eyes moving across the assembled crew, taking in their posture, their expressions, the shift that had taken place without orders, without command. Shut it down, he said calmly, and the technician nearest the controls hesitated for just a fraction of a second before complying, fingers moving carefully as the turbines began to wind down, the powerful hum fading into a controlled silence, one that felt entirely different from the one before, not broken, not uncertain, but complete. Mercer stepped closer to the aircraft, his hand brushing lightly along the edge of the same panel Eli had adjusted, his fingers pausing there, as if confirming something only he understood. Then he looked back at Holt, his expression measured. How long was it down? Holt cleared his throat, the question simple, but the answer suddenly carrying weight. Approximately 4 hours, sir. Mercer nodded once, his gaze shifting briefly to the technicians. And none of your systems flagged the fault. It was not a question, and no one answered, because there was no answer that would not sound incomplete. Mercer let the silence settle, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement. Then he turned back to Eli, the movement deliberate, respectful. That tolerance drift, he said quietly. It does not show up in diagnostics until it is too late. Eli gave a small nod, the kind that confirmed understanding without needing words. And in that exchange, something became clear. To everyone watching, this was not guesswork. This was not luck. This was knowledge, earned over time, carried quietly, and revealed only when necessary. Lucas Reed felt it settle fully now. The realization that what he had witnessed was not just skill, but something deeper, something that could not be taught through manuals or simulations. Mercer took one final step closer to Eli, the distance between them now minimal, and for the first time since he had arrived, his posture shifted in a way that was unmistakable, not lowering, not diminishing, but aligning, acknowledging. You were a crew chief, he said, and Eli did not answer with words, only a slight incline of his head, and that was enough. Mercer exhaled slowly, then turned back toward the others, his voice carrying clearly across the tarmac. This aircraft is operational because of him. The statement was direct, undeniable, and it landed with a weight that silenced any remaining doubt. Holt felt it more than anyone. The shift from control to accountability, from assumption to reality. And for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would restore what had been lost. Mercer looked at him then, not with anger, not with reprimand, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Rank does not replace experience, he said evenly, and the words settled over the group like the fading heat of the engines, lingering, undeniable. Eli Carter did not react to any of it. He simply reached down, picked up his worn leather pouch, and closed it with the same quiet care he had shown from the beginning, as if the moment, for him, had already passed. No one stopped him as Eli Carter turned away from the aircraft, not Captain Holt, not the technicians, not even Colonel Mercer. Because something about the moment had shifted beyond authority, beyond protocol, into a space where interruption felt wrong, almost disrespectful. The old man moved at the same unhurried pace he had carried from the beginning, the worn leather pouch resting once again in his hand, its surface catching the sunlight in dull, quiet reflections, and as he walked across the edge of the tarmac, the heat shimmered around him like a curtain slowly closing on something that had already been decided. Lucas Reed watched him go, the image imprinting itself in his mind, not as a dramatic exit, but as something far more powerful, something defined by its simplicity, its certainty, its lack of need for recognition. Behind him, the aircraft sat ready, alive in a way it had not been before, not because of the systems that governed it, but because someone had understood it, truly understood it, and that realization lingered heavier than any sound the engines had made. Captain Holt remained where he stood, his posture still rigid, but his expression no longer sharp, the certainty that had fueled his commands earlier replaced by something quieter, something reflective. He glanced briefly toward the panel Eli had adjusted, then back toward the empty space where the old man had been, as if trying to reconcile the gap between what he knew and what had just happened. But there was no quick resolution, no immediate answer, only the weight of a lesson that did not announce itself. Colonel Mercer broke the silence first, not with an order, but with a simple acknowledgement. "Get it prepped for flight," he said, his tone returning to command. But the edge had softened, shaped now by what he had witnessed. The technicians moved again, but differently this time, their actions more deliberate, more aware, as if each step carried new meaning. Reed lingered for a moment longer before turning back to his station. But the way he looked at the aircraft had changed. The way he listened had changed, and though nothing in the system logs would ever show it, he knew something had been added that day, something that could not be measured, only learned. Mercer remained still for a second longer, his gaze drifting once more toward the far edge of the runway where Eli's figure had nearly disappeared into the glare, and for just a brief moment, he gave the slightest nod, not as a gesture for others to see, but as a recognition given where it was due, quiet, precise, and complete. The airfield returned to motion around them, the rhythm of operations resuming, voices rising again, vehicles moving, systems running. But beneath it all, something had shifted, something that would stay long after the sound of the engines faded, because not every lesson arrives with noise, and not every master needs to speak. Some simply show up, do what no one else can, and leave before anyone fully understands what they have witnessed, and in that silence, something lasting is left behind, something that does not demand respect, but earns it, and is remembered long after the moment has passed.